So there I was, working at this tiny independent coffee shop called April's in downtown Portland. Nothing fancy, just cracked linoleum floors, mismatched chairs that wobbled if you looked at them wrong, and windows so old they probably remembered when coffee cost a nickel. But man, that place had character. The smell of freshly ground Arabica beans hung in the air like incense, and even our ancient espresso machine had more personality than most people I knew. I wasn't there for the money. Let's be real, baristas don't exactly drive Lamborghinis. I was there because I genuinely love the morning routine. You know how some people need their meditation or yoga. This was mine. Unlocking the door at 5:30 a.m., firing up the machines, arranging the pastries just right. There's something almost sacred about those quiet moments before the caffeine addicts descend like zombies, seeking their daily resurrection. My regulars were like family. There was Margaret, the retired teacher who always ordered a vanilla latte with extra foam and tipped in quarters she'd been saving since the Carter administration. Then there was Derek, this tech bro who'd roll up in his Tesla, but still said please and thank you like his mama raised him right. These weren't just transactions. They were tiny human connections that made getting up at 4:45 a.m. actually worth it. One Tuesday morning, around 6:15, this guy walks in wearing a jacket that had seen better decades. Not dirty, mind you, just worn down to the threads like an old friendship. His shoes were the kind of faded that happens when you walk everywhere, because driving isn't really an option. But his hair was combed neat, and something about the way he carried himself told me this wasn't his first rodeo with hard times. He approaches the counter with this quiet dignity that immediately caught my attention. Most people rush in, already talking before they've even made eye contact, rattling off their order like they're placing a bid in an auction. This guy took his time, looked me in the eye, and simply said he wanted black coffee. No sugar, no cream, no fancy syrups. Just straight-up coffee the way it was meant to be. I poured him a large cup of our house blend. Nothing too strong, nothing too weak, just honest coffee for what seemed like an honest man. When I told him it was $2.50, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out 3 old coins, what looked like a couple of silver dollars and some smaller change. The coins had this dull shine that only comes with age. He noticed my curiosity and explained that paper money in banks made him nervous. So he preferred to carry his money in forms that felt more real and couldn't just disappear with computer glitch. Fair enough. After 2008, plenty of Americans had trust issues with financial institutions. I wasn't about to judge a man's survival strategies, especially when he was being polite and paying for his coffee. I picked up the coins without really examining them closely, dropped them in the register, and handed him his coffee. That's when he introduced himself as Gray. Not gray, but gray, like the color of storm clouds. I told him my name was Alex, and something about that simple exchange felt more genuine than most conversations I'd had all week. From that day forward, Gray became part of my morning routine. He'd show up around the same time, order the same black coffee, pay with various old coins from his collection, and we'd exchange pleasantries about the weather or how the coffee was brewing that day. Never anything too deep. Never anything too personal. Just two guys acknowledging each other's existence in a world that often makes people feel invisible. What struck me most about Gray wasn't his appearance or his unusual payment method. It was his consistency. In a society where people change jobs, relationships, and entire personalities like they're switching TV channels, here was someone who showed up every single day, rain or shine. There was something almost noble about that level of commitment to such a simple ritual. I started looking forward to his visits more than I probably should have, not because of any dramatic reason, but because Gray represented something I'd been missing without realizing it. Authentic human connection without agenda. He wasn't networking, wasn't trying to impress anyone, wasn't performing for social media. He was just being present, and in our increasingly distracted world, that felt revolutionary. Little did I know that those morning coffees were about to change my entire life in ways I couldn't have imagined. Sometimes the most ordinary moments are just the calm before the most extraordinary storms, and Gray's quiet presence was about to become the center of a whirlwind that would challenge everything I thought I knew about value, dignity, and what it really means to see people for who they are rather than what they appear to be. Trevor was everything I wasn't as a barista, and honestly, Everything I hoped I'd never become as a human being. This guy had been working at April's for about 6 months when I started, and he treated the job like he was auditioning for some reality show about the world's most insufferable coffee snob. While I genuinely enjoyed connecting with our customers, Trevor saw them as either useful networking opportunities or obstacles to his daily Instagram content creation. The morning after Gray's third visit, Trevor decided to share his unsolicited wisdom while we were restocking the pastry case. He had this way of talking that made everything sound like he was explaining quantum physics to a golden retriever. According to Trevor, he could spot trouble from a mile away, and Gray was apparently broadcasting red flags like a Soviet parade. Trevor launched into his analysis of Gray's appearance, financial situation, and general life choices with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced a single day of genuine hardship. He suggested that maybe I should start a coffee delivery service specifically for homeless people, complete with air quotes and that smirk that made you want to check if your wallet was still in your pocket. I kept my response short and simple. Gray pays for his coffee, and a discussion. But Trevor wasn't finished with his performance. He had theories about Gray's payment method, speculating that those old coins were probably worthless trinkets from some estate sale dumpster dive. The way Trevor said it, you'd think Gray was trying to pay with Monopoly money and Chuck E. Cheese tokens. What really got under my skin was Trevor's assertion that Gray stunk of desperation and was somehow driving away our normal customers. First off, Gray was cleaner than half the tech bros who stumbled in reeking of energy drinks and poor life decisions. Second, what exactly qualified as normal in Trevor's narrow worldview? Anyone who didn't drive a car worth more than most people's annual salary? Unfortunately, our conversation wasn't as private as I'd hoped. Mr. Johnson, the owner, had been in the back office doing whatever small business owners do when they're not actively watching their investment generate revenue. He emerged just in time to catch Trevor's dissertation on customer demographics and quality control, and I could see the gears turning behind his carefully neutral expression. Johnson wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't running a charity either. He bought April's as part of some diversified investment portfolio his financial advisor had recommended. The man knew spreadsheets better than coffee beans, and every decision filtered through a cost-benefit analysis that would make an accountant weep tears of joy. To him, customers were data points, not people with stories and struggles. The next morning, Johnson cornered me during my pre-opening routine. He had that tone people use when they're about to deliver news that's supposedly for your own good, but really serves their interests. According to Johnson, April's wasn't shelter or community center. It was a business that needed to maintain a certain atmosphere to attract the kind of customers who actually generated profit. Johnson explained that while politeness was expected, excessive friendliness could send the wrong message about what kind of establishment we were running. He worried that being too welcoming to certain types of customers might create an environment that would make our bread-and-butter clientele uncomfortable. The subtext was clear. Gray's presence was potentially bad for business. I tried to argue that Gray was a paying customer who caused zero problems and actually brightened my mornings with his quiet consistency. But Johnson had already made up his mind based on Trevor's expert analysis and his own risk-averse business philosophy. He painted a picture of slippery slopes and worst-case scenarios where accepting unusual payment methods today led to accepting broken glass and subway tokens tomorrow. The conversation ended with what Johnson probably thought was a reasonable compromise, but felt more like an ultimatum wrapped in corporate speak. He wanted me to maintain professional distance and discourage Gray from becoming too comfortable in our space. If Gray continued to visit regularly, I was supposed to politely but firmly suggest he find somewhere else to get his daily coffee fix. As Johnson walked away, I realized this wasn't really about Gray at all. This was about two completely different philosophies of what a business should be and how we should treat people who don't fit neat categories. Trevor saw customers as props in his personal brand story. Johnson saw them as revenue streams with risk factors. And I apparently saw them as actual human beings deserving of basic dignity. Standing there with my apron still tied and the morning rush approaching, I knew exactly what kind of person I was. Some decisions don't require much thinking. They just require you to be yourself. Consequences be damned. The next morning felt different from the moment I unlocked the door. Trevor arrived 20 minutes early, which should have been my first red flag, since the guy usually showed up with exactly 30 seconds to spare before his shift officially started. He busied himself with unnecessary tasks, wiping down already clean surfaces and rearranging the pastry display, like he was preparing for a health inspection by Gordon Ramsay himself. Mr. Johnson was lurking in the back office, and I could hear him shuffling papers with the kind of aggressive intensity that meant he was trying to look busy while actually just waiting for something to happen. The whole setup felt like a poorly planned intervention, except instead of helping someone overcome addiction, they were staging an ambush to help someone overcome basic human decency. At exactly 6:15, Gray walked through the door like clockwork. Same worn jacket, same careful dignity, same quiet presence that somehow made the whole coffee shop feel more authentic just by him being there. He approached the counter with his usual unhurried pace, completely unaware that he'd walked into what felt like the world's most passive-aggressive trap. Gray looked me in the eye and placed his order with that familiar simplicity that had become such a reliable part of my morning routine. Black coffee, no sugar, no complications, just a straightforward request from a straightforward man who deserved nothing more complicated than getting what he paid for without judgment or drama. I poured his coffee exactly the way I always did, making sure it was hot but not scalding, strong but not bitter. As I handed him the cup, I added the detail about no sugar that had become our little ritual, a small acknowledgement that I remembered his preferences and valued his consistency. It was such a minor thing, but in a world where people barely look up from their phones, remembering someone's coffee order felt revolutionary. That's when Trevor decided to make his presence known with the kind of theatrical cough that's designed to announce disapproval rather than clear any actual throat irritation. It was the sound equivalent of rolling your eyes so hard they fall out of your head, and it hung in the air like a fart in an elevator, impossible to ignore and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Mr. Johnson emerged from his office like he'd been waiting for his cue in some badly written workplace drama. He positioned himself next to the counter with his arms crossed in that universal pose of authority figures who want to make sure everyone knows they're the boss without actually having to say it out loud. The whole scene felt orchestrated, like they'd rehearsed this confrontation during some secret manager meeting I hadn't been invited to. Johnson's voice cut through the morning quiet with the kind of volume that was meant to embarrass rather than inform. He reminded me of our previous conversation with the tone of a disappointed parent catching their kid sneaking cookies before dinner. The implication was clear. I had defied direct orders and was now facing the consequences of my insubordination in front of witnesses. I stood there holding Gray's coffee money, feeling the weight of those old coins in my palm while Johnson waited for some kind of response or apology. But what was I supposed to say? That I was sorry for treating a paying customer with basic respect? That I regretted acknowledging someone's humanity instead of treating them like a business liability? Some things don't deserve explanations or justifications. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap. Gray stood quietly beside the counter, still holding his coffee, probably wondering if he'd accidentally walked into someone else's personal drama. Trevor continued his performance of looking busy, while obviously listening to every word, and Johnson's crossed arms seemed to be getting tighter with each passing second. After my shift ended, Johnson called me into his office for what he diplomatically called a conversation, but felt more like a corporate execution. The whole thing lasted exactly as long as it takes to microwave leftover pizza, just enough time to deliver the bad news without any of the courtesy of actual discussion or the possibility of appeal. Johnson's dismissal was delivered with the kind of professional coldness that makes you wonder if some people practice being heartless in front of mirrors. According to him, we were no longer a good fit for each other's professional needs, which was corporate speak for, "You're fired for having a conscience." No severance, no references, no acknowledgement of the months I'd spent making his investment profitable. I untied my apron for the last time, left my keys on his desk, and walked toward the door, feeling like I'd just been kicked out of my own family. The familiar sounds of the espresso machine and the smell of fresh coffee suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else's life, and I realized how much of my identity had been wrapped up in this job that apparently meant nothing to the people who profited from it. Just as I reached the door, Gray appeared beside me like he'd been waiting for this moment. Without any dramatic speeches or expressions of sympathy, he simply pressed another old coin into my hand. He said it was payment for the coffee and for remembering names, as if basic human recognition was some kind of premium service that deserved extra compensation. I slipped the coin into my pocket without looking at it, too emotionally drained to process what had just happened or what this gesture meant. All I knew was that in a morning full of disappointment and corporate betrayal, one person had shown me that kindness still existed, even when it cost you everything you thought you needed. Getting fired without savings is like being thrown into the deep end of a pool when you never learn to swim. Suddenly, every decision becomes about survival instead of comfort. My rent was due in exactly 7 days. My bank account had enough money to buy maybe 3 decent meals, and the job market for former baristas with principles apparently wasn't as robust as I'd hoped. Within 48 hours, I was working every gig I could find just to keep my head above water. Nights were spent at a car wash on the south side, scrubbing SUVs that cost more than most people's houses, while trying not to think about how dramatically my life had changed. Days were filled with food delivery runs, carrying bags of Thai food and pizza to people who tipped in singles and looked at me like I was invisible. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now working harder than I ever had at April's, making less money, and dealing with people who treated service workers like disposable machinery. Every interaction reminded me how rare gray, simple courtesy had been, and how stupid I had been to think that basic human decency was worth risking financial stability over. 3 weeks into my new life as Portland's most educated car washer and food delivery specialist, I finally had a quiet evening at home. My studio apartment felt smaller than usual, probably because I was spending so much time working that coming home felt like visiting a place I used to live. I was exhausted, broke, and starting to wonder if maybe Johnson had been right about keeping business and personal value separate. That's when I remembered Gray's coin, still sitting in the pocket of the jeans I'd worn on my last day at April's. I'd been so focused on finding new income sources that I'd completely forgotten about his parting gesture. As I pulled it out, I expected to find another interesting, but essentially worthless piece of old American currency, maybe worth a few dollars to a coin collector. The coin felt heavier than I remembered, with edges that had been worn smooth by decades of handling. Under my cheap desk lamp, I could make out the date, 1794, engraved in thin, precise numbers that seemed almost impossibly old. The profile of a woman with flowing hair looked back at me with the kind of craftsmanship that modern minting couldn't replicate. My first Google search was casual curiosity, the kind of late-night internet rabbit hole that usually leads to learning random facts about historical currency or mint production techniques. But when the search results loaded, my casual interest turned into heart-stopping disbelief. This wasn't just any old coin. It was potentially one of the rarest pieces of American currency ever created. I searched again, thinking I'd made some mistake or misread the date. Then I found a magnifying glass I bought for some long-forgotten hobby project and examined every detail of the coin under the strongest light I could find. The flowing hair dollar, the first silver dollar produced by the United States Mint, with only a few dozen known examples still in existence. The next morning, I called in sick to both my jobs and drove to a professional coin appraiser downtown. The woman behind the counter took one look at my coin and immediately called her supervisor, who called someone else, who called what I assumed was either the FBI or the Smithsonian. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a room full of people with magnifying glasses and reference books, feeling like I'd accidentally discovered a lost Picasso at a garage sale. The authentication process took 2 weeks and involved more paperwork than buying a house. Every test confirmed what the internet had suggested. I was holding one of the most valuable coins in American history. The appraiser recommended a specific auction house that specialized in rare currency, and I spent another week learning about provenance insurance and the surprisingly complex world of numismatic sales. The auction itself felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold in real time. Bidders participated by phone from around the world, and the numbers being thrown around seemed completely disconnected from reality. When the hammer finally fell at $10,250,000, I sat there trying to process the fact that Gray's casual coffee payment had just changed my entire existence. After auction fees, taxes, and various professional services, I walked away with approximately $8 million. Everything was completely legal, properly documented, and verified by experts who knew more about historical currency than I'd ever know about anything. The whole transaction took less than 2 months from start to finish, and suddenly I went from washing cars for minimum wage to having more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. The strangest part wasn't the money itself. It was realizing that Gray had known exactly what he was giving me. Nobody carries around coins worth millions of dollars by accident, and nobody gives them away for coffee without understanding the magnitude of that gesture. He'd essentially handed me a winning lottery ticket disguised as a tip, and I couldn't even begin to understand why. By March, Portland's coffee scene had shifted like it always does. Places close, new ones open, and the cycle continues with the ruthless efficiency of urban capitalism. April's had lasted exactly 3 months after I left, which was probably 2 months longer than anyone expected given Johnson's business model of treating customers like potential lawsuits and employees like replaceable machinery. When I heard the space was available, I didn't even hesitate. The real estate agent seemed confused about why someone would want to buy a failed coffee shop in a neighborhood that wasn't exactly trending upward. But money talks louder than market analysis. I bought the entire building, not just a commercial space, because sometimes you need to own your foundation to build something that lasts. Walking back into that space felt like returning to a childhood home that had been abandoned and forgotten. The same cracked linoleum, the same wobbling chairs, even the same coffee stains on the counter that Johnson had never bothered to properly clean. The espresso machine was still there, looking sad and neglected, like a musical instrument that hadn't been played in months. I kept everything exactly as it was, down to the mismatched furniture and the windows that needed better weather stripping. This wasn't about creating some fancy new establishment. It was about preserving something that had mattered, even if only a few people understood why. The only change I made was a sign outside, which now read Gray's in simple black letters that you could read from the street. The tagline underneath was my personal mission statement and middle finger to the previous management philosophy. Everyone welcome, every payment accepted. I had business cards made with the same message, not because I expected to need them, but because sometimes you have to put your values in writing to remember what you stand for when things get complicated. Opening day was deliberately low-key. No grand opening specials, no social media campaigns, no attempt to generate buzz or foot traffic. I just unlocked the door at 5:30 a.m., fired up the espresso machine, and waited to see who would show up. The first customer was Margaret, the retired teacher who still tipped in quarters, and she acted like no time had passed at all. By noon, word had gotten around the neighborhood that the coffee shop was back under new management. Derek rolled up in his Tesla and seemed genuinely happy to see me behind the counter again. Even some of April's former employees stopped by, though Trevor was notably absent, probably because he'd moved on to ruining the atmosphere at some other establishment. The second day was when everything came full circle. I was restocking the pastry case when I heard the familiar sound of the door opening with that particular squeak that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this place originally. When I looked up, there was Gray, wearing the same weather jacket and carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had made him memorable in the first place. He approached the counter like he'd never been away, like the past 6 months of my life transformation had been some kind of intermission rather than a complete upheaval of everything I thought I knew about money, value, and human connection. His observation about the new ownership was delivered with the same understated awareness that characterized everything about him. I told her we had the same coffee but new management, which was both literally true and completely inadequate to describe what had actually happened. When I said his first cup was on the house forever, I meant it in ways that went far beyond normal customer service. This man had given me everything, not just money, but the opportunity to build something meaningful. The most remarkable thing about our reunion was what didn't happen. Gray never asked about the coin, never inquired about auction results, never showed any curiosity about what his gift had meant to my life. It was like he'd expected this outcome all along, like he'd seen some future that I couldn't have imagined when I was just a barista trying to treat people with basic respect. Instead of discussing life-changing financial windfalls, I handed him a key to the apartment upstairs. It wasn't charity, it was partnership. The space had been empty since I bought the building, and having someone I trusted living above the shop felt like the right kind of security system. Plus, Gray had earned the right to never worry about having a place to sleep or get his morning coffee. His response about living above a coffee shop was delivered with the same matter-of-fact wisdom that had characterized our entire relationship. Of course, he understood that proximity to fresh coffee was one of life's underrated luxuries. Of course, he saw the practical benefits of the arrangement. Of course, he accepted my offer with the same gracious simplicity that had made him memorable in the first place. As I watched Gray settle into his usual chair with his usual black coffee in a space that was now officially his as much as mine, I realized this story wasn't really about money or rare coins or business revenge. It was about recognizing value in places where other people see problems, and about how treating people with dignity sometimes comes back to you in ways you never could have predicted.